much for attending the second plenary session of the 11th meetings. I'm really very honored and pleased to introduce our dear guest speaker, Professor Samuel Freeman. Professor Samuel Freeman is Professor of Philosophy and of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, where he has been teaching since 1985, the year he received his PhD from Harvard University. As some of you may know, John Rawls was his dissertation supervisor. I'm sure that most, if not all, participants know the work and the books in the field of social and political philosophy, ethics and philosophy of law of Professor Samuel Freeman. Among other publications, he has published books like Liberalism and Distributive Justice in 2018, Justice and the Social Contract, and also a book which is very useful on John Rawls, published by Routledge in 2007. I'm also sure that some of us who teach contemporary political philosophy, that's my case, already had the privilege to study and use the books of the Professor Freeman as published or edited on John Rawls. I think it is important to highlight or remind that Professor Freeman edited this famous Cambridge Companion to Rawls, which is a very useful and rigorous tool for scholars and also for teachers. Indeed, the arduous task of teaching Rawls political philosophy to undergraduate and even to graduate students becomes considerably simpler when we can recommend books like this, and like the one already mentioned, published in 2007. They are extremely well written and very clear, I dare to say, much clearer than Rawls himself. But of course, the value and scope of Professor Freeman's work and published works go much further than what I highlighted. He devoted a large part of his life and career to the study of Rawls' political philosophy and related topics such as liberalism and theories of the social contract. He is indeed recognized as one of the leading authorities on the political philosophy of John Rawls and on liberalism. We couldn't be more pleased with your presence here, dear Professor Samuel Freeman. To conclude this presentation, I would like to mention that the theme chosen for this plenary conference is perfectly suited to the general theme of this conference, which is, as you know, contemporary challenges to the citizenship and democracy. In fact, to put the question very simple and broadly, we could say that one of the conceptions of democracy and citizenship, as well as its theoretical justification, that is being challenged as we speak now, is one that could be supported by John Rawls. What do I mean by that? I mean an egalitarian conception of liberal democracy, very progressive, very concerned with social justice, and also the kind of theoretical justification that is provided in its favor by Rawls. Is this the adequate paradigm or framework to defend an egalitarian perspective of democracy, considering the emergence of right-wing populism, for instance, and other challenges? Of course, we know that on the left side, especially on the left side, the communitarian and feminist critiques are not new, and they shouldn't be despised. But recently, as you know, Professor Charles Mills, in his Tanner conference, drew attention to what we might call the dark side of liberalism, and egalitarian liberalism as well, not to mention Rawls' political philosophy. So what is at stake here? It's inadequacy and incapacity to address the structural injustices, for instance, in the basic structure, present and in racist societies like, as it is mentioned by Charles Mills, the United States of America. And what it's at stake is the racial justice, and that should be corrected, since the distributive justice is not enough to address the problems that exist in racist societies. So that issue, according to Charles Mills, has been neglected by the dominant theory and also the history of liberalism. This is a case similar to feminism. So it's a big challenge, I think, a big challenge that is posed by this type of critic of Rawls' political philosophy. And so it will be extremely interesting to hear Professor Freeman's response in this conference. So I could go on about this, but we are here to listen to what Professor Samuel Freeman has to say about ideal theory and racial justice on Charles Mills' tenor lecture, which is the title of his lecture. So I don't want to take you more time. I thank you once more on behalf of the organizing committee for having kindly accepted our invitation to deliver this plenary conference. And so I hand out immediately to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Martins. I very much appreciate being invited to give a talk at this conference. I only wish that I could be there in person. It's always great to go to Portugal and Spain. I have 4 grandchildren in Spain, so I'm very often over there. Unfortunately, not the past year and a half. So this paper, I gave a comment when Charles Mills presented his tenor lecture last year in February of 2020, entitled Theorizing Racial Justice. Since that time, he's published the lecture, at least it's published on University of Utah Tanner Lecture website. But what this paper is prepared for him, this is a shorter version of a longer paper. It's to be published in a volume along with Professor Mills' Tanner Lecture next year. The various people contributing to that are working on it, and this is a shortened version of my contribution. So I'm going to read the paper because of my Southern accent, and sometimes I speak too fast. I prepared some PowerPoints, which I'll go through as I go through the main content of the paper. So I'm going to put those up now, and you won't see much of me except in a small box, but at least I think it'll help you understand get the content of the paper better. So let me get started with this. Yeah, there we are. Good. So the name of the paper is Ideal Theory and Racial Justice. Some introductory remarks. In his recent Tanner lecture, Theorizing Racial Justice, Charles Mills focuses on John Rawls's claim made in Justice is Fairness, the restatement, that his theory of justice is designed for a democratic society and not, quote, a racist one. But indeed, the United States is a racist society, Mill insists. So Rawls's theory of justice cannot apply to assess or correct the long history of racial justice in the United States. Rawls's, quote, ideal theory of racial justice is largely, ideal theory of justice is largely irrelevant and hence inapplicable to non-ideal, unjust societies such as the United States. This means, Mills concludes, that for 50 years, philosophical discussions of justice have been governed by a theory of justice which does not even apply to our circumstances, but instead only applies to a fantastical, well-ordered, and perfectly just society. Those are Rawls's terms. Mills concludes that Rawls's entire body of work has been a diversion, a work that has masked racial injustice, and for that reason is itself a work of epistemic injustice. Mills does not deny or question Rawls's fundamental assumption of moral equality of all persons, nor the social and political equality of all citizens implicit in Rawls's principles of justice. Nor does Mills deny Rawls's basic principle of equal basic liberties, nor the idea of substantive equal opportunities, nor economic reciprocity and the difference principle. Nor does Mills even reject Rawls's original position and veil of ignorance. Instead, he adapts the original position to address racial injustice in his own proposed non-ideal theory of corrective racial justice. This is not a major departure from Rawls either, since Rawls explicitly endorses the extension of the original position to address injustices within non-ideal theory. So where does Rawls go wrong, according to Charles Mills? Rawls's primary offense is one of omission. His exclusive focus on ideal theory, an ideal theory of justice for a well-ordered democratic society, prevents Rawls from addressing questions of racial injustice and rectification for African Americans, as well as Native Americans and other people of color oppressed by the white majority in the US. For this transgression of Rawls's theory of justice, Rawls's entire theory, including the principles of moral, social, and political equality it embodies, as well as the critique of capitalism, it's all pronounced Jim Crow philosophy and complicit with a long history of, quote, racial liberalism. Now, I'll not contest Mills's claim that the US is a racist society. I'll focus instead on what I believe to be a significant misinterpretation of Rawls's work that is central to Mill's indictment of Rawls. It's his longstanding argument that Rawls's ideal theory of justice does not apply to non-ideal circumstances to assess the injustices of actual societies, including racist societies, but rather Rawls's theory only applies to ideal societies for which it's designed. I will argue to the contrary, that Rawls's ideal theory of justice and a theory of justice applies to all societies, no matter how unjust. Moreover, political liberalism applies to racist societies that are also democratic. I contend that racial injustice involves the systematic violation of each and every principle and ideal of Rawls's ideal theory of justice. Moreover, the proper rectification of racial injustice that Mills aspires to requires the application of the very liberal egalitarian principles that Mills claims are irrelevant to our society. Ideal theory and the application of justice as fairness to a democratic society. Charles Mills has long argued that Rawls's theory of justice is not relevant to our non-ideal, unjust world because it's designed to apply to a perfectly just, well-ordered society. Now, Mills was one of the earliest critics of Rawls's use of ideal theory along with Amartya Sen. Since then, a large critical literature has evolved which contends that ideal theory is utopian and irrelevant to contemporary societies and their many injustices. It's ironic that Rawls's theory of justice is regarded as utopian since his theory was largely designed to avoid this charge. He devotes a large part of a theory of justice in part 3, also in political liberalism, to arguing for the feasibility and stability of justice as fairness, contending that this conception is compatible with human moral psychology, social theory, and realistic democratic institutions and our natural sense of justice. And in theory, he argued that acting for the sake of justice is congruent with the human good. Mills contends, however, that his ideal theory, Rawls's theory of justice, only applies to perfectly just, or at best, nearly perfectly just societies, and that since the United States is not even nearly just, but is a racist society, Rawls's theory of justice cannot apply to us. Mills rightly notes that this is not how Rawls himself regarded his view. Rawls, he claims, regarded the US as a nearly just society that is troubled by racism. But this misperception was grounded in a liberal white philosopher's inability to recognize how unjust and profoundly racist the basic structure of American society really is. But in fact, Rawls did not think the US is a nearly just society. He explicitly denies the US is just, or even nearly just. For example, after theory appeared in 1971, in 1973, Rawls publicly stated, I would find it very difficult to see how anyone who's lived in this country could think it is a just or nearly just society as I define justice. To think this is to fail to work out the implications of the principles of justice. Similarly, in Rawls's 1995 reply to Habermas, he says that existing societies can contain grave injustices, as American society did and still does. But the fact that Rawls did not see the United States as a just or nearly just society, as measured by his principles of justice, does not rebut Mill's main charge, which is that Rawls's ideal theory of justice does not apply to our unjust society, in spite of the fact that Rawls thinks it does. The reason Rawls's principles of justice do not apply to the US society on Mill's account is that Rawls's ideal theory of a perfectly just democratic society is incapable of providing a basis for non-ideal theory that rectifies a history of racial injustice in a racist society. To address racial injustice in our racist society, we need a non-ideal theory of corrective racial justice, completely different from Rawls's ideal theory. The ideal theory of a perfectly just society, where everyone complies with principles and requirements of justice, is inapplicable to seriously racially unjust societies, says Mills. I'll argue to the contrary, that any non-ideal theory of justice that addresses the ongoing history of racial injustice in the United States and Western societies must be grounded in the ideal theory of a democratic society and applied to our unjust, non-ideal world. Non-ideal theory presupposes and is inseparable from ideal theory. Indeed, there is no non-ideal theory of injustice that does not build upon ideal theory of justice, since what makes non-ideal theory non-ideal is just that it addresses departures from the ideal theory it presupposes. Now, this is not simply a matter of semantics or terminology. The deeper point fully address the historical injustices of racism. First, know what the fundamental principles and requirements of justice are, just as to adequately address the flaws of invalid arguments, we first need to know the principles that govern valid inferences in arguments. Rawls's aims in the theory of justice and political liberalism. In the preface to A Theory of Justice, Rawls says his aim is to develop a theory of justice that generalizes the traditional theory of the social contract of Locke, Rousseau, and Kant. He says his theory best approximates our considered judgments of justice, that it offers a superior account of justice to the dominant utilitarian tradition, and that it constitutes, quote, the most appropriate moral basis for a democratic society. He does not say his theory only applies to a democratic society. Indeed, Rawls seeks to tell us what justice requires regardless of the society or the historical era to which his theory is applied. His general conception of justice applies to unfavorable conditions, which include non-ideal societies that have not yet reached a stage of development where they can protect equal basic rights and liberties and other requirements of Rawls's special conception of the two principles of justice. The two principles in serial order with priority given to equal basic liberties are, Rawls says, the long-run tendency of the general conception of justice. Rawls explicitly states the principles of justice apply to any society that's capable of maintaining the basic liberties. Quote, the equal basic liberties can be denied only when it is necessary to change the quality of civilization so that in due course, everyone can enjoy these freedoms. It's in theory of justice. Rawls then clearly thought in theory that justice is fairness and the two principles of justice should apply to injustices in any society capable of sustaining basic rights and liberties, no matter how unjust or racist that society may be. Now, Mills does not say why any of the specific equal basic rights, liberties, opportunities, or natural duties in Rawls's principles of justice should not apply to the US or to unjust societies. Instead, to support his argument that Rawls's conception of justice does not apply to the unjust societies, he appeals to Rawls's restatement, Justice is Fairness, a Restatement, as the final definitive statement of Rawls's view. There, Rawls says that, quote, justice is fairness is a political conception of justice for the special case of the basic structure of a modern democratic society. Now, this claim is not significantly different from Rawls's claim in the first edition of Theory, where he says that justice is fairness constitutes the most appropriate moral basis for a democratic society. There, Rawls intended his theory of justice to set forth requirements of justice for all societies, whether democratic or not. So what reason is there to assume that Rawls thought otherwise 20 years later in the Restatement? Well, political liberalism aside, the reason that Mill provides is that Rawls's statement 7 pages later says, Rawls says, from the start then, we view a democratic society as a political society that excludes a confessional or an aristocratic state, not to mention a caste, slave, or a racist one. It's the second sentence that Mills heavily relies on, that a democratic society excludes a racist one, which he joins with Rawls's earlier claim that justice is fairness is a political conception for the basic structure of a democratic society. Mills infers that if a political conception is designed for a democratic society, then it cannot apply to a racist society. But this doesn't follow. Simply because something constructed for some purpose does not mean that it cannot be applied to other purposes. Mills consistently conflates these two different ideas. For a conception of justice constructed for a democratic society to apply to a society simply means it provides appropriate standards for judging the institutions of that society. Rawls's conception of justice provides appropriate standards by which to judge a democratic society such as the US that's marked by a continuing history of racism. Rawls's theory also provides appropriate standards to judge a racist society that pretends to be democratic. Call this a racist democratic society, as the United States was, from its constitutional origins in 1789 up through the Civil War, then even into the 20th century, at least until the Civil Rights era. And since Mill insists, let's concede even up to the present day. We're a racist democratic society. Nonetheless, what other standards are more appropriate for assessing the injustices of US history and society than Rawls's or some other liberal egalitarian standards of justice? Mills does not suggest an alternative, nor does he argue that Rawls's liberal egalitarian principles themselves are unjust or otherwise inappropriate. Indeed, he relies upon liberal egalitarian principles to condemn a history of enduring racism in the West. But he argues these principles do not address and rectify a history of continual racial injustice. Now, even if this were true, it does not mean that Rawls's conception of justice does not apply to assess and criticize the many injustices that mark the history of the United States and other Western societies. For a democratic society, that's Rawls's term. Charles Mills contends the United States is not a democratic society, or even a democratic society marked by racism. But the United States is fundamentally a racist society that has been and is still characterized by white supremacy, in spite of the ineffective efforts to eradicate racism from political and social life. I agree there's racism and significant racist bias embedded in American society. Racism in large part accounts for the 2016 election of Donald Trump as president and the continuing support for him. Nonetheless, there are also considerable democratic institutions and tendencies within American society and practices. What does Rawls mean in saying that his conception of justice is for a democratic society? Well, one thing he means is that in a democratic society, the ideas of freedom and equality are widely held by members of society and are part of its political culture, even if these ideas are not consistently practiced, and there's still people who are openly racist or who believe they're not racist, but still exhibit racist prejudices. Now, Joshua Cohen contends in For a Democratic Society that Rawls means three things by a democratic society. First, a democratic society involves an absence of feudalism and aristocracy, and its members are recognized by its political culture as free persons who are morally and socially equals. Second, a democratic society has a democratic form of government with a representative legislature, equal political rights, and regular elections. Third, a democratic society aspires to be a deliberative democracy where political argument appeals to reasons that address the common interests of free and equal citizens. So as Rawls says in Theory of Justice, it is a political convention of a democratic society to appeal to common interests. Now, Mills denies the US is a democratic society and insists that instead it's a racist society, as if the two were mutually exclusive. But considering the wide appeal of political values of freedom and equality in US political culture, and the three features of democratic society that Joshua Cohen mentions, the word democracy does not mischaracterize US government and society, even though racial prejudice and explicit racism are still widespread. The United States, a constitutional democracy, whose states are all constitutionally required to have a democratic form of government. Also, the US Constitution explicitly prohibits titles of nobility, and since the 1950s, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to guarantee equal opportunity, even allowing affirmative action for racial minorities in education, also guarantees equal rights of citizens to vote and hold office, equality of constitutional rights and liberties, all of which are essential to a democratic society. Appeals to the common good and shared common interests are, as Rawls says, a political convention of United States democracy, however hypocritical these appeals may be by politicians and private interests. Finally, the principles of a racist, caste, and aristocratic society are publicly rejected and condemned in our political culture. Mills, however, contends that the United States has made at best a half-hearted effort at enacting the ideals of a democratic society, and that our current conservative Supreme Court and state governments are retreating from democratic ideals and institutions. Moreover, Mills' focus is not simply on the institutions of government and the ideals of freedom and equality in our public culture and so on. He looks rather at our history and actual racist practices and prejudices that have endured among a sizable portion of the US population. He claims that even if there are certain institutions that can be pointed to in alleging our society is democratic, nonetheless, non-institutional social norms and practices and the actual workings of social and political institutions reveal we are instead a racist society plagued by systemic racism. Now, Rawls assumes in theory that a democratic society whose members are regarded as free and socially equal persons is a precondition to justice under modern conditions, and that this ideal supplies the standards by which to assess the degree of injustice within all existing societies. So even if we grant that Mills is right, that our basic structure and social practices are those of a society that is more racist than democratic, this still means we're a racist democratic society, and we're fundamentally unjust according to Rawls's and any other liberal egalitarian conception of justice. The fact that we're a racist democratic society is simply irrelevant to the application of Rawls's conception of justice to the US, so long as Rawls's liberal egalitarian principles are appropriate standards by which to assess the injustices of our racist democratic society. It's clear that in a theory of justice, that justice's fairness applies to any society capable of protecting basic rights and liberties, and their priority. For societies incapable of doing so, the general conception of justice applies. I do not think Rawls intended to significantly change this position in political liberalism, where he dropped the general conception of justice and sought to broaden the appeal of justice as fairness. He claimed that rather than being an alternative to utilitarianism, justice as fairness is compatible, at least with certain versions of utilitarianism and other reasonable, comprehensive philosophical, moral, and religious doctrines that would be affirmed by reasonable persons within a well-ordered democratic society. The difference is that in political liberalism, Rawls no longer seeks to provide a theory of justice that applies universally to all societies. But he does not claim, as Mills assumes, that his conception of justice does not apply to non-democratic societies. Instead, for purposes of political liberalism, he brackets the question of moral truth and whether justice as fairness is universally applicable to all societies. By constructing a political conception of justice that's based in fundamental ideas implicit in the democratic culture or political culture of a democratic society, Rawls is not committing himself to relativism, as Mills seems to suggest in claiming that Rawls's principles do not apply to a racist society. Rawls must reject relativism about justice as part of political liberalism, just as he brackets the question of the nature and possibility of moral truth. Now, Charles Mills surely must admit that some liberal egalitarian conception of justice is appropriate to apply to what he regards as our fundamentally racist society. For unlike his critical predecessor, Marx, Mills must assume a non-relativistic, objective conception of justice and social equality, because he says he's constructing a theory of corrective justice in rectification of a history of racism. He grounds his criticisms of what he calls racial liberalism in, quote, a radical liberal ideal of moral equality of free and equal persons. But he does not say how these radical liberal ideals differ from Rawls's ideal of free and equal moral persons. Like Rawls, Mills must assume at some point that a fundamental aspect of his non-ideal theory is a principle of equal basic rights and liberties and substantive equal opportunities of moral persons. Otherwise, his argument for corrective racial justice has no grounding. For if justice is relativistic and ideological, then there's nothing to rectify in the transition from the allegedly racist society that Mills claims we are to the more democratic societies that both Rawls and Mills aspire to. But relativism cannot be Mills's position. The main difference between Mills and Rawls here is not that Mills rejects liberal egalitarian principles of justice. Rather, it's that Mills locates the principles of moral and social equality he relies on within his non-ideal theory of corrective justice, whereas for Rawls, a non-ideal theory of transitional justice is grounded in an antecedent ideal theory that sets forth objective requirements of justice for a democratic society. That's a methodological difference between Rawls and Mills. It's not a significant moral or political difference that Mills pretends it is. Now to turn to Rawls's social contract as ideal theory. As with ideal theory, Charles Mills has also argued at length against liberal and democratic social contract doctrines. This is in his book, The Racial Contract, and he continues it in many other papers, even the Tanner Lecture. He contends social contract theories are fundamentally flawed because while advocating the freedom and equality of persons, the major historical advocates, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, and of course Hobbes, were nonetheless racist, sexist, and white male supremacists. Following the critical method in Rousseau's own second discourse on inequality, Mills critically applies social contract doctrine to expose a fraudulent racial contract, which he calls a domination contract, that allegedly underlies predominantly white supremacist exploitation and subjugation of racial minorities in Western societies. This critical contractarian analysis of racial injustice is an essential part of a non-ideal theory of corrective justice, Mills claims. Then he turns from critical social contract theory to normative social contract theory to advocate principles of corrective justice that free and equal persons agree to. Rather than rejecting social contract doctrine here, he rather contends that it must be preceded by an historical analysis of racial injustice that is incorporated into non-ideal contractarian theory. Now, the critical use of social contract theory is one way, but surely not the only or even a good way to provide an historical analysis of racial injustice. Let's grant that the justification of moral principles must be preceded by an awareness and understanding of historical injustice. Surely this does not imply that social contract doctrine is necessary for that purpose or even helpful. For starting with Frederick Douglass, few, if any, of the major works on racial injustice, other than Mills, pretend to rely on critical social contract theory. But if so, then why must critical social contract analysis of historical injustice be a precondition for normative social contract theory to justify fundamental principles of justice or principles of corrective justice that address their infringement? There are too many other more reliable ways to understand the history of racial injustice than by inventing the fiction that white members of society unanimously agree to slavery, Jim Crow, and a continuing history of racial exploitation and subjugation. Moreover, it's questionable whether social contract doctrine is even suitable for analyzing injustice. At least Rousseau's fraudulent social contract, depicting the origins of inequality, assumed everyone's agreement, including the poor, to submit to a repressive state and abide by its laws. The fraud consisted in the misinformation that led the poor to agree to be exploited and dominated by the wealthy and powerful. Unlike Rousseau, however, Mill's racial contract is not a fraudulent social contract made by everyone with everyone else, but it's an exclusionary coalition contract, he calls it a domination contract, among the racially privileged members of society to oppress and subjugate racial minorities. And they take no part in and certainly do not consent to their domination. Mill's racial contract does not satisfy Mill's racial contract does not satisfy the generality, universality, and reciprocity conditions of social contract theory, which require that every member of society be represented and mutually benefit from social cooperation. Nor does the racial contract represent the freedom and moral equality of all persons subjected to it, but it's designed to do the opposite, to deny the freedom and equality of those excluded from participation. Far from representing a social contract among all persons, the purpose of the racial domination contract Mills imagines is to exclude and subjugate a portion of the population and deprive them of their moral status as free and equal persons. Now, I've claimed that an essential presupposition of non-ideal theory is ideal theory itself, an account of the fundamental requirements of justice. One cannot pretend to do non-ideal theory without assuming ideal theory, since what makes the theory non-ideal is that it addresses violations of the ideal of our fundamental requirements of justice. Mills, however, contends that parties in the original position and members of a well-ordered society require knowledge of a history of racial injustice before they can agree on any principles of justice. Though ideal theory surely requires a knowledge of history and its many injustices, unlike Mills, I think we should assume that the fundamental principles of social and political justice can and perhaps must be developed independently of theories of corrective justice that presuppose them. I agree with Mills in recognizing that knowledge of a history of racial injustice is relevant to verifying the fundamental principles of justice within ideal theory. We need to check principles of justice against our considered convictions of justice and our convictions of injustice in coming to a reflective equilibrium on them. If the principles of ideal theory do not condemn racist institutions and racial practices and prejudices as unjust above all else, as classical utilitarianism does not, then that disqualifies them as sound principles of justice. Knowledge of historical and existing injustice is also relevant, as Mills contends, to decide and apply principles of corrected justice and determine appropriate measures of rectification. But unlike Mills, I do not see why this knowledge needs to be incorporated within the ideal theory of justice that corrective justice presupposes. We need knowledge of historical, racial, and other injustices in order to assess the adequacy of an ideal theory of justice, such as RAWLS's, and to come to reflective equilibrium on its principles. But this does not imply Mill's position that the artificial parties to the hypothetical social contract, both in the original position and as members of a well-ordered society, themselves need knowledge of the history of racial injustice in order to determine the fundamental principles of justice that are necessary for us to judge and assess the extent of those very injustices. This confuses the points of view of hypothetical persons behind a veil of ignorance and as members of a well-ordered society in what they must know to come to agreement on fundamental principles of justice with our own point of view and what we must know to come to reflective equilibrium on those principles. Now I'll address the idea of strict compliance within ideal theory. RAWLS's parties in the original position choose and agree to principles for an ideal, well-ordered society where everyone accepts and normally complies with those principles of justice. The original position itself, RAWLS says, mirrors the moral features of a well-ordered societies and models free and equal citizens' general acceptance of principles of justice that govern a well-ordered society. It's characteristic of liberal normative social contract doctrines to regard the parties to the social contract as agreeing to principles that free and equal moral persons all can reasonably and rationally accept and commit themselves to within society. Ideal theory with assumptions of general acceptance and strict compliance is then built into the structure of liberal and democratic social contract theories. These theoretical ideas of general acceptance and strict compliance have parallels in other eras in moral philosophy. Kant's categorical imperative and its formulas of universal law and a kingdom of ends are ideal theory. We should will to act only on laws that rational beings all could rationally will and comply with, as if by a law of nature, and also within an ideal social world where all are motivated by a good will. Also, rule utilitarians have interpreted Kant's categorical imperative as a universalizability requirement that tests the validity of social rules and principles by asking us to imagine the consequences of everyone's full compliance with them. This too is ideal theory, in the sense of an assumption of strict compliance to determine moral principles that apply to us here and now. Many critics of RAWLS, including Mills, claim that because the parties in the original position choose principles of justice for an ideal society, in which there's assumed to be strict compliance, these principles cannot apply to our own society. But that simply misunderstands the role of strict compliance in the hypothetical construct of a well-ordered society. Like the original position, they are an integral part of a philosophical thought experiment that's designed to discover what and justify what justice requires in our own society. The very point of engaging in this hypothetical inquiry in ideal theory is to discover principles of justice that apply to our non-ideal society, and indeed to any society, including racist ones, in order to discover the nature and extent of injustices that exist in actual societies. Simply because the parties in the original position agree to principles all will accept and comply with in a well-ordered society cannot mean these principles cannot apply to our society. What would be the point of conjecturing principles that artificial people can agree to and comply with if they do not apply to our unjust society? This is the way that Rawls and everyone else, including Mills, understood justice as fairness for over 40 years. It was only once Mills and other critical philosophers, such as Amartya Sen, David Schmitz, Jerry Gauss, and others, noticed that the artificial parties in the original position are choosing principles not for their own non-ideal society, but for an ideal society of which they are members and where everyone agrees on justice, that anyone began to question the applicability of Rawls's principles to our society. Critics then made the mistaken argument that because these artificial principles are choosing principles for because these artificial people are choosing principles for an ideal society, that somehow these principles cannot apply to us. But this is an implicit rejection, not just of social contract doctrine, but of Kant and Kantian doctrines, rule consequentialism, and other attempts in moral philosophy to address the fundamental questions of moral philosophy by assuming universal compliance. Now, it's true that from the point of view of parties in the original position, the principles are intended to apply to a well-ordered society where these principles are fully complied with. But again, it's important not to confuse the point of view of artificial persons in the original position in a well-ordered society and what they're trying to achieve with our own point of view as actual members of a democratic society and what we are trying to achieve by engaging in this thought experiment. From the point of view of you and me now, who are assessing the correctness of a conception of justice, the purpose of ideal theory is to enable us to come to a reflective equilibrium on the most appropriate conception of justice for any democratic society in non-ideal circumstances, no matter how racist and unjust. And indeed, in a theory of justice, with its general conception, to come to agreement on a theory of justice that applies to any and every non-ideal society. Okay, this is the last section. The relationship of ideal to non-ideal theory. Earlier I said that what makes non-ideal theory non-ideal is that it addresses violations of the principles of ideal theory, just as what makes a society unjust is that it addresses, just as what makes a society unjust is that it violates the fundamental principles and requirements of justice. Mills contends that non-ideal theory is needed to apply principles of justice to existing societies that are unjust. But non-ideal theory is not needed to apply Rawls's principles of justice to determine the injustices existing in actual societies. Justice as fairness can be directly applied without the mediation of non-ideal theory to identify and criticize a society's injustices and its members' violation of their moral duties and obligations of justice. Injustice is readily apparent simply by comparing historical circumstances with the principles and requirements of justice. There's no uncertainty about the fact that the historical denial of the right to vote to women and African Americans violates the equal rights of political participation in Rawls's first principle. Likewise, the denial of rights of racial minorities to compete for occupations and other social positions violates freedom of occupation and fair equal opportunities. Trump's proposal to stop food stamps and Medicaid to 1 million citizens clearly violates the adequate social minimum guaranteed by Rawls's principles. Finally, it's obvious that historical and continuing racism perpetrates countless injustices that violate each and every one of Rawls's principles of justice and the natural duties of justice, mutual respect, and obligations of fairness. We can know this just by comparing racial institutions, racist institutions, practices, and actions directly with Rawls's principles, duties, and obligations of justice. It's the primary role of ideal theory of justice to identify and guide criticism of injustices in non-ideal circumstances and then provide bases for reform. Rawls says, well, he says that. He also says, quote, injustices that are identified by the extent of the deviation from perfect justice. Also, existing institutions are to be judged in the light of this conception and held to be unjust to the extent that they depart from it without sufficient reason. Well, if non-ideal theory is not needed to identify, criticize, or assess the degree of racial and other injustices, what is its role? Non-ideal theory addresses the injustices that are identified by ideal theory by providing principles designed to remove, reform, and rectify existing and past injustices and compensate for past wrongs. It consists of principles of reform, transition, compensation, and other forms of rectification of the injustices that arise from violating the fundamental principles of ideal theory that determine when injustice occurs. We do not need non-ideal theory to say that an injustice has been done, nor do we need non-ideal theory to tell us to cease doing injustice. Instead, non-ideal theory provides an essential role in addressing the rectification and reform of injustice. But even then, ideal theory has a crucial practical role in shaping non-ideal theory. Contrary to Mills, non-ideal theory is not a separate inquiry from ideal theory. In engaging in non-ideal theory, we do not leave ideal theory behind. Rawls says, ideal theory is the fundamental part of the theory of justice and essential for the non-ideal part as well. In addition to identifying and critically assessing injustice and its extent, there are at least three further ways Rawls's ideal conception of justice is essential to non-ideal theory. First, ideal theory guides the cessation, removal, and prevention of existing injustice. Rawls says we have a natural duty to remove any injustices, starting with the most grievous. This natural duty especially applies to governments and their officials in the exercise of their political authority. The principles and requirements of justice of ideal theory identify the injustices to be removed and require governments to cease enforcement of and eliminate unjust laws and practices. In addition, the ideal theory provides non-ideal theory with the moral constraints on and prevention of any further enactment or enforcement of new laws and public policies that are unjust. So Charles Mills' three principles of corrective racial justice, this is the substance that the basic substance Mills gives to his non-ideal theory of corrective racial justice, principle to end racially to end racially unequal citizenship, to end racial exploitation, and to end racial disrespect. These all reflect these requirements of ideal theory, and they immediately follow from the application of justice as fairness to racially unjust societies. Second, the reform and transition to just institutions. It's the second way that ideal theory is essential to non-ideal theory. In addition to the cessation and removal of injustice, the natural duty of justice requires society to reform existing institutions in the direction of a more just society. Rawls says an ideal conception of the social order is set up, which is to regulate the direction and change and the efforts of reform. The principles of justice, quote, belong to ideal theory and set up an aim to guide the course of social reform. In this way, quote, ideal theory is a necessary complement to non-ideal theory, without which the desire for change lacks an aim. The principles, requirements, and concepts of ideal theory thus provide grounds for the reform of injustice and the transition to a situation where principles of justice are better realized within institutions, laws, and practices. Rawls further says ideal theory presents a conception of a just society where we are to achieve, if we can, or at least work toward, in gradual steps. Then there's a long quote here, which I'll skip the first sentence. Non-ideal theory presupposes ideal theory on hand, for until the ideal is identified, at least in outline, non-ideal theory lacks an objective by reference to which its questions can be answered. Now, the natural duty to promote justice is not a consequentialist duty to take the most effective means to reform unjust institutions and realize those that are more just. Transitional measures are constrained by the principles of justice and their priority rules. especially the non-violation of equal basic rights and liberties and the natural duties, which, with few exceptions, strictly apply in non-ideal circumstances. But the requirements of the second principle's fair equality of opportunity and the difference principle are more flexible, and their requirements vary in non-ideal circumstances, depending on the degree of injustice to which they are to be applied and the likelihood of its success in applying them. For example, in order to guarantee fair opportunities to people of color against a background of enduring racial injustice and its effect, preferential treatment may be allowed or even required. Mills disagrees with this and says in earlier work that because preferential treatment is unjust in a well-ordered society, it cannot be permissible in non-ideal conditions either. He relies on a paper by Robert Taylor for this. But this misunderstands the application of principles of justice to non-ideal circumstances, which is not fixed by the laws that hold in a well-ordered society. This is a widespread misunderstanding of the role of the idea of a well-ordered society, which you find in Amartya Sen, Jerry Gauss, David Schmidt, and other criticisms of Rawls's ideal theory in addition to Mills. The role of a well-ordered society is mainly to justify the principles of justice. Its role is not to determine the application of principles of justice to non-ideal circumstances. Moreover, I don't believe that the well-ordered society is even to be used as a state of affairs that guides the application of the principles of justice to reform unjust societies. Hence, the requirements of the fair equality of opportunity principle under non-ideal conditions differ from its requirements in ideal conditions of a well-ordered society. Preferential treatment in the allocation of education and employment and other social positions can be one of several necessary transitional measures of reform required to give fair, equal opportunities to racial minorities in non-ideal conditions. In unjust conditions, it's only fair that the more advantaged members of the white majority, whose social position has benefited from an ongoing history of racial injustice, be assessed according to stricter standards than are members of racially disadvantaged groups. Another example of justice in transition is the application of Rawls's difference principle to non-ideal circumstances, which requires not simply reducing inequality and improving the position of the least advantaged class, but also that society enact measures that put into place an economic system in which the least advantaged are better off than they would be in any other economic system. Rawls says this is either a property-owning democracy or liberal socialism. In order to transition from capitalism to a more just economic system, society will often have to enact measures such as the gradual redistribution of economic wealth to all members of society that temporarily lowers aggregate wealth in society and everyone's standard of living. These measures are not maximally beneficial to the least advantaged at the time and may even make them worse off in the short run, so long as they do not maximally benefit the same, they may do that, but they're permissible so long as they do maximally benefit the same least advantaged people eventually. This is an unavoidable cost of transition from an unjust economic system to a more just economy. So one step backwards, two steps forward. But it's required by the application of the difference principle under non-ideal conditions. The general point is that rather than ideal and non-ideal theory being two separate theories addressing different questions as Mills maintains, ideal theory and its principles of justice are indispensable to determining non-ideal theories of reform and transition to more just laws and institutions. The principles, duties, and values of ideal justice are incorporated as an essential ingredient of non-ideal theories of prevention, reform, and transition. Finally, the third way ideal theory is essential to non-ideal theory is in non-ideal theories of corrective and compensatory justice. The requirements of ideal theory provide the foundations for corrective justice including retributive justice and the theory of punishment, as Rawls says, compensatory justice to address civil wrongs in the law of torts, contract and property, civil disobedience, militant resistance, and just war theory, all of which Rawls mentions in theory of justice. In the restatement, Rawls also mentions non-ideal theory to address problems of discrimination based on race and gender, and the measures needed to, quote, secure the equality of women and minorities. Now, other than civil disobedience and conscientious refusal, Rawls does not say much in the theory of justice about corrective principles that apply only to non-ideal conditions. But clearly, Rawls envisions the use of the original position and four-stage sequence to work out the terms of principles of non-ideal theory. He says, non-ideal theory is worked out after an ideal conception of justice has been chosen. Only then do the parties ask which principles to adopt under less happy conditions. So Mills has grounds for his suggestion that a revised original position can be used for non-ideal theory to work out the terms of corrective justice. Whereas the idealized parties in Rawls's original position have no knowledge of historical injustice and are not focused on their correction or remediation of injustice, in applying the ideal conception to non-ideal conditions for purposes of rectification, the parties in the original position do require factual knowledge of the injustices they address. But Rawls's framework already has a way to accommodate the theory of corrective racial justice that Mills envisions. For once the principles of justice are in place, the appropriate way to understand principles and other requirements of corrective justice is that they should be decided at the constitutional and legislative stages of a four-stage sequence, which are to be impartially applied with full knowledge of relevant facts at its fourth stage. So Mill's own proposed non-ideal theory of corrective justice, determined behind a veil of ignorance, is not too dissimilar from Rawls's suggestions. Mills, in the end, turns out to be a Rawlsian revisionist. Finally, to conclude, Mills chastises Rawls for failing to address racial justice, which he defines narrowly as principles of corrective racial justice, including reparations. He contends it just should have been the first item of business on Rawls's agenda, not an afterthought or simply ignored. It would have indeed been very helpful to know what Rawls might have said about corrective racial justice and reparations, including any substantive principles and recommendations he might have proposed. But I've argued that for Rawls, a non-ideal theory of corrective justice and reparations cannot be the first order of business, since they require prior fundamental principles of justice that specify and identify the basic rights and liberties, fair equal opportunities, a fair social minimum, and natural duties and obligations that have all been violated by a history of racial injustice. A theory of corrective justice, including Mill's proposed theory, has no content without fundamental principles of justice that identify the violations of justice standing in need of correction and their magnitude. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your enlightening lecture. At any rate, it provides a very effective and robust reply to Mill's criticism. But anyway, I think there are many issues here to discuss, so we have time to discuss now your lecture. So anyone that wishes to raise questions is free to do it now. Please be brief. I will try to see if is there anyone I've seen. I hope I don't. Professor Kyle, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed that. I just wanted to ask, this won't really touch on the central themes of relationship between ideal and non-ideal theory, but early in the presentation, and this is, I'm not familiar with Mills's Tanner lectures, so early in the presentation, you mentioned that you were not going to contest his characterization of the United States as a racist society. But then you went on to diagnose a kind of confusion in Mills as being committed to the position that a society could not be both democratic and racist. And it seems that, anyway, one position that he might be taking is not that it's not possible to be both democratic and racist, but that in fact the United States is racist in a way that is at odds with characterizing it as democratic. And if he is making that kind of claim, then it seems that you could not be allowing him that. That is, it seems that you would need to be contesting that description of the United States.
Well, I tried to do that by going over the characteristics of what I think Rawls meant by a democratic society. And then I said, you know, that we approximate those many characteristics. So I'm challenging the claim that either a society is racist or is perfectly just. It's perfectly, to be democratic, it has to be perfectly, you know, it has to be non-racist. Can't have any racist elements. If that's what he's arguing, then, you know, I think that's just an unreasonable, of course, it's an unreasonable position. I mean, it just seems to be a society is to some degree to racist, maybe it's to some degree democratic. I mean, you can measure the scalar degree in which a society is racist. You can measure the scalar degree in which is democratic. That was my point. He can't have it his own way and say that to be democratic, the society has to be perfectly democratic or realize these institutions have absolutely no racism. So that's, you know, that was my response, I think. And even if it's true, I mean, we're a racist society. We still are capable of giving priority to and protecting the basic rights and liberties. And that's the very condition Rawls says for the special conception of justice with the two principles applying to a society, right? A thoroughly racist society that is capable of nonetheless legally enforcing the basic rights and liberties and is subject to the special conception and the two principles of justice. If it's not capable of it, then the general conception applies, right? But Rawls isn't addressing that in political liberalism. Yeah, is that?
And sorry, just to follow up very quickly. And do you think that, again, not being familiar with Mills's piece, do you think that Mills would contest that claim that the United States is capable of?
Capable of not, is capable of enforcing, say, the First Amendment or the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. I mean, are we perfectly capable? No, but that is the point, right? He can't define a democratic society as a perfectly just democratic society. He can't get away with that. I mean, I just don't see. But even if it's true, there's still the two principles. I mean, yeah, we're partly capable. No one's perfectly capable of, you know, all moral principles, right? So if that's his standard, I don't see what the argument is. Yeah, but I take your point. I mean, Henry Richardson raised the same criticism, you might say, of the paper, or remark, made the same remark. Are we really capable of realizing the first principle with this priority? Yeah. I'd say, well, you know, we've done a pretty good job. But
Henry was one of my dissertation advisors for
yeah, well, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you have the floor, Katerina.
Thank you, Pedro. I'm not sure if George was first, but I'll take it. George can ask afterwards. So thank you very much, Professor Samuel Freeman. It was very interesting, and I really enjoyed your talk. I wanted to ask, I'm not super familiar with Mill's take also, but I wanted to challenge or to ask you, in the beginning of your talk, you discussed how Rawls was trying to avoid being seen, or his theory being considered as kind of utopia. And I wanted to ask you if your framing of this ideal theory, which can anchor non-ideal theory, namely Charles Mill's corrective racial injustice, won't it fall prey by anchoring your non-ideal theory in ideal theory? Won't ideal theory, namely RAWLS, be prey to be considered as utopia?
So is the question that there's reason to believe that a well-ordered society, as Rawls describes it, is utopian and hence unattainable? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, especially if you're anchoring, if you're saying that non-ideal theory, which kind of seems to make sense to me, needs ideal theory to understand the key principles of justice and to identify key injustices in current society. And by anchoring ideal theory within non-ideal theory, as we were saying, it seemed to me that we could say, okay, then this ideal theory and these principles that Rawls is discussing are simply utopian, and they can indeed guide our analysis of certain injustices and help us reforming them, but they cannot really help us attain a just society in the end, or it's not possible to do so.
So as I understand that, you're saying that, well, even if the principles of justice for a well-ordered society that Rawls argues for are utopian, nonetheless, they can guide non-ideal theory, right?
Yeah, I'm not discussing your conclusion, which seems to make sense. I'm just saying that they just follow with the conclusion that they are utopia and we will not be able
yeah. Well, I mean, that's, I think Dave Estlin's position and maybe Jerry Cohen. I mean, it could be true. I don't know. But for Rawls, it was important that a well-ordered society be at least achievable, and by that he meant consistent with natural human capacities and tendencies, and not something that's unachievable given the kinds of beings that we are, and given the nature of social cooperation and so on. I think so. In that sense, he was. I mean, this is, of course, a lot of people disagree with this because that's why he appealing to certain facts about human beings and our sense of self-respect and so on, and were so important to him, is to argue that, look, I mean, he was following, I think, Rousseau there. I mean, Rousseau, the sentence often quoted in the beginning of the Social Contract, that taking man as he is and society as it ought to be, what kind of society can be best realized. That's where Rawls was coming out of that. And in that way, he departs from a lot of maybe, he doesn't read Kant that way, but you might read Kant that way. But even Kant said, famously, ought implies can, and there's that, and this is kind of a version of that, I think. So, if you think that the view is utopian, then but it's still okay, that's fine. I think Rawls wanted to avoid that. It was very important to him to avoid that because he thought that, he was denying the dualisms. He mentioned this, denying the dualism that Kant and many other philosophers have relied on, that the analytic synthetic distinction, necessary contingent, all this stuff, and necessary truths and that. I mean, it was just part of the age in the mid 50s, the kind of influence of Wittgenstein and Quine and many others. He didn't want to have to rely on anything like that, so he wanted to be able to rely on, economic science, social science, psychology, and so on, to argue what the fundamental requirements of justice are. And I think that makes sense. But yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now we have 5 requests, so I will follow the order. Could you please be brief in your questions? Next request is George Sanchez.
Thank you very much. It's actually Jorge Sanchez Perez, so it's Spanish, not Portuguese.
Sorry.
That's okay. As long as you don't call me George as in English, we're friends. Professor Freeman, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure listening to your talk. I actually had the pleasure of listening to Professor Charles Mills exactly last week, discussing his position about non-ideal theory.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, I agree with you that there's a misconception between the relationship between ideal and non-ideal theory that a lot of non-ideal theories are pushing forward. In my perspective, sorry for building this up, they all have implicit ideal theories as that they are not exposing beforehand, which compromises the possibility of the discussion of which principles they're endorsing before they engage in the non-ideal exercise.
Yeah.
That being said, when you said the requirements of ideal theory provide foundations for corrective justice, including compensatory justice to repair and compensate for civil and criminal wrongs, I want to push on that, not because I disagree that we cannot get the proper foundations for that, but I want to know what you think about the possibility of making ideal theory a tool to engage with those things, not as a secondary element, let's say third or fourth steps in the four-step process of the RAWLSian program. But let's say, is it ideal theory necessarily incompatible with racial injustices, gender injustices, and it's only compatible with scarcity of resources? Because I agree with what you said in your review of Katarina Forrester's book. RAWLS did give us a language to talk about political philosophy, but that doesn't mean that we have to accept all the significance that he gave us. In my account, I don't see the methodological impossibility to use ideal theory to be compatible with those other problems. We would have competing theories, but it seems like when RAWLS says ideal theory, it seems to imply him that ideal theory is only compatible with scarcity of resources and not with other problems of the world. Do you think that
ideal theory is only compatible with what? I didn't understand.
With it seems to imply that ideal theory, the ideal theory way of approaching justice, is only compatible with the scarcity of resources and not with other elements or with other possible elements such as racial injustices, gender injustices, etc. So that is my concern. That is basically the second chapter of my dissertation. That's what I'm working on. I like ideal theory. I don't necessarily enjoy the methodological limitations that we inherited from RAWLS. So I would just like your thoughts, whether you think that might be possible or not. And if that doesn't make sense, I can repeat.
Well, I think RAWLS, maybe I understand it. I think RAWLS assumes scarcity of resources that justifies that principles of justice, particularly economic justice, apply in case of scarcity of resources. I mean, that, he says that comes from Hume, but I think he takes for granted that because of certain facts about human nature, that people, want generally more than what they've got, at least if there are certain lower levels of subsistence, and that they've got to produce it in order to enjoy it. But there's people always desire more than there is to satisfy their desires, right? So we need some kind of principle of economic justice in order to determine how to distribute the social product that you might say that come from economic production and so on. So that's just a fact about human beings. So and he wants to say that that's why we need a theory of economic justice, right? Whereas that's just built into the nature of human existence and social relations. Injustice, racial injustice, gender injustice, and so on, that's not built into the nature of human relationships. That's something that we can change and improve, and for that reason it's unjust, right? It's unjust. We're capable of treating one another as equals, as equal persons, whereas unless we don't live in a manna economy, we're always going to demand, people in society of the world are always going to demand or want more goods and services than they've got. So we have to produce things, and then things get produced. So how do we fairly divide up the social product? I think that's the difference. That's the difference, right? Does that respond in part to your concern?
Yes. Thank you very much. It does allow me to understand this answer in light of your 2018 book. where this explanation is given in a way to justify the difference between global and domestic justice, the principles. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a long list of requests. So next is William Reckner.
Thank you. So I know this debate a little bit, not super well, but I thought your talk helped me because I've struggled to understand what really the crux of the debate has been, and so thanks for the help in thinking about that. I wanted to come back to the point about racist societies and democratic societies and how to think about that in this context. I don't want to put words in Mills's mouth, because I don't think I know his positions well enough to try to do that, nor would I try, but I'm not sure that he's thinking about it in terms of societies are democratic to a degree and racist to a degree. I wonder if his view isn't more that it's a question about what's more fundamental to how a society and its institutions are structured. And so if the view is that a society is more fundamentally racist than it is democratic, or more fundamentally democratic than it is racist, and then you think that the actual history of the United States shows that white supremacy is really the more fundamental of the two kind of structures, then a lot of the Rawlsian basic concepts don't get a lot of purchase, like the idea of society as a cooperative venture, or the basic equality of free and equal citizens. And so I was wondering if thinking about the question that way complicates it, or whether you think you would give the same kind of response if that was where the critique is coming from.
Yeah, so he argues in the lecture and elsewhere that, well, look, I mean, Rawls says this is what society is. It involves social cooperation, which involves mutual benefit. But you look at the US, and there's not cooperation for mutual benefit, there's exploitation, blah, blah, blah. So Rawls just misconceives what society is. So how could his theory apply to us, to a society which is misconceived? We don't really regard one another as free and equal people. So how could this ideal of persons apply to us? I mean, I think the answer to that is that Rawls is not doing sociology, and he's not doing psychology when he's setting forth the fundamental ideals and principles in the view. He's appealing, I think, to what you might say as a Western political moral consciousness, and the fact that we do have these moral ideals of free and equal persons, and we do have these moral ideals that people ought to be held responsible if they're capable of controlling their conduct and complying with complying with the laws and so on. And also that society ought to be for mutual benefit, and ought to be fair distribution or reciprocity and for mutual benefit and so on. That those are ideals. I mean, he calls them intuitive ideas in political liberalism. In a longer version of this paper, I talk about this, and Mill's argument that society, in fact, is not the way Rawls assumes it is. The point is that Rawls is not, he's not giving a description of existing societies. He's taking an ideal of society, and then he's building on the basis of that, this fundamental intuitive idea of social cooperation. He's constructing on the basis of that, and the idea of the person, the ideal of a well-ordered society. And he says he wants to argue that's what applies to us, because these are the moral ideals implicit in democratic culture. Sure, they're in racist people, some of them even reject these ideals. Some small, KKK, neo-Nazis and so on, but the vast majority of people, even people who are racist, do have these ideals, and they object when people treat them without respect. They object when people violate their democratic rights and so on. So that's just part of the lingua franca, you might say, of democratic society, and that's what he's trying to capture. So the facts on the ground aren't relevant to working out the ideals that ought to apply to a democratic society and the fundamental principles of justice we ought to live under. I think that would be my response to that. Yeah. Does that to get to? It's not. I didn't state it so eloquently, and
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yes, right. Well, I'm glad it's somewhat helpful.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have Professor Samuel Scheffler wants to pose a question as well.
No, I have many opportunities to talk to Samuel Freeman, so I'll defer to other people who have fewer opportunities and might want to take advantage of them now. So thank you, but I'll pass.
Well, thank you very much for your kindness. We have Carolina. Carolina.
Hello.
Hello.
I would like to know if we can link the existing world to the ideal by a kind of political perfectionism, maybe through an ideal social process, so you can have a realistic utopia. I don't know if it was clear, my question. If we can link the existing social world to the ideal by made by a kind of a perfectionism, political perfectionism, maybe through a ideal social process.
I mean, what do you mean by political perfectionism? Do you mean the doctrine that Rawls talks about, which he rejects, that principles
not anchor in the conception doctrines in political way, not in the
right.
I forgot the word. The word.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doctrines. There are comprehensive doctrines. Comprehensive doctrines. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Rawls' theory is based on certain ideals and an ideal of society, what society ought to be like. He talks about a realistic utopia, a well-ordered society is at least achievable. We're never going to reach it, right? But it's achievable. There's nothing in human nature that would prevent us from living from a society which conforms to these principles of justice and so on. And that's an ideal. But he doesn't want to call that perfectionism, of course, because it doesn't involve perfections of culture in the way that, say, the Aristotelians or Nietzsche or others argued for. He wants to say that this ideal of society is perfectly compatible with people who have different religious, moral views. Some people may be perfectionists, some are non-perfectionists, some may be hedonists, some may be moral skeptics. Nonetheless, it's compatible. The ideal of society, or the ideal conception of justice, is compatible with their all, and they're accepting that ideal is compatible with that. You don't have to be a perfectionist to accept this ideal of society and the principles that govern it. Does that sort of respond?
Okay. No, because he said in the political liberalism that he's not a perfectionist. If by perfectionist we mean comprehensive doctrine, but maybe we can talk about another kind of perfectionism. But it's okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Misha Lazar, you can pose the question now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that Mills is just one of the two people who attack RAWLS, the use of ideal theory in RAWLS. The other one is Amartya Sen. And I think Sen tackled something head on that's not really explicit in Mills, I think, but you mentioned in your talk in defense of Mills, namely that we need an ideal to do non-ideal theory. And if I remember correctly, Sen in the paper and then in the book, he says, no, we don't, right? We can, for instance, we can compare, two paintings in respect of their artistic merit, but we don't need an idea of an ideal painting or something like that. And he has a couple of other examples along these lines that are supposed to jog our intuition to the effect that no ideal is needed to do to know what's more or less just or unjust. And I was just wondering what you made of those arguments. Thanks.
Well, yeah, I mean, so we don't need, I guess we don't need to know the Mona Lisa or Leonardo or Michelangelo or whatever in order to be able to decide whether Picasso is a better painting than a Dali, right? But nonetheless, we do have standards, right? We do have standards in coming to judge, aesthetic standards in coming to judge those. And we're applying those standards, and those standards themselves are standards of I've never taken aesthetics, so I'm not the person to talk about this. Those standards themselves are to give us, enable us to make these judgments or more or less better. Well, the idea of saying something is more or less better assumes that there is some standard for measuring them, right? So even, Sen says, yeah, of course we don't need it, right? I mean, we don't need Sen's view to tell us anything, right? I mean, he just wants to engage in intuitive kind of comparisons about moral states of affairs. I mean, anybody can do that. We don't need fundamental moral theory. We don't need ideal theory. We don't need philosophy. And that's, that's, if that's what he's saying, fine. Yeah, we all know that, right? But engaging in philosophical attempts to discover fundamental requirements of justice has a role, and even a practical role, I'd like to think. So I don't deny his kind of trivial claim that in order to decide, whether or not social welfare state is better than laissez-faire capitalism, we don't need John Rawls to tell us that. Well, of course we don't. We don't need Amartya Sen either. Right? We don't need any philosopher to tell us that. We can just go on our moral convictions. But we are relying on some kind of moral principles and making those assumptions. And that's what ideal theory tries to discover, at least the way that Rawls is trying to discover the fundamental principles that guide our democratic reasoning about justice, right? Does that sort of feebly respond to the question? In other words, I can agree with Sen. Of course we don't need it, but we don't need philosophy either. I mean, what's he, but the fact is that we are applying some kind of standards of better or worse, and which themselves, if you try to work them out, are going to appeal to some sort of fundamental standards of some kind, standards of judgment. That's what you're trying to get at in ideal theory. Is he saying that's irrelevant? I don't see how he can say it's irrelevant if he himself relies on it and making the comparisons. Yeah. Thanks. Good question.
Thank you very much. We have two more requests. I don't know which is the first one, but I think it's George Grego.
Okay, thank you. I've put my hand down because I'm not sure if my question is similar or even exactly the same as William, because I'm not acquainted with Mills, but I was thinking that maybe what he tries to say is that if any society does not accept the overarching ideas that Rawls uses, in my case, I was thinking of human beings as free and equal moral persons, then the ideal theory cannot be used or is useless, because the problem we have is another one, which is we are dealing with a society which starts from different points of view as we as Western societies have. So I was thinking if this could be a kind of beneficial or sympathetic interpretation of Mills, just to say, maybe he thinks, I don't think so, but in the United States, there's no common understanding of the human being as free and equal moral persons. Therefore, an ideal theory based on this overarching idea cannot be useful in our current situation in the United States. I don't know, just one interpretation I thought of.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of relativism position that we take the views of a majority or vast majority about morality and right and wrong. And if some people are considered inferior to others, well, that's just the morality of that society. People in that society can come to a reflective equilibrium on that morality. Maybe even the people who are treated, in a caste society, they can accept that they're inferior. But Rawls doesn't accept that's the appropriate morality for that society, and I don't think Mills accepts that's the appropriate morality for that society. He can't accept that position if he wants to argue that there has been racial injustice in the United States for all its history, right? He just can't accept that position. So otherwise, why would he be trying to? What's the correct? If it's not unjust, according to this relativist theory of justice that guides racist societies, then there's nothing to correct. So why is he engaged in this enterprise? But clearly, he wants to criticize liberalism for not living up to its ideals, and for liberal philosophers for not concerning themselves more with questions of racial justice and injustice. And that's a valid criticism, I think, right? But I think he's going about it the wrong way by arguing that Rawls's theory just doesn't apply. I don't see. That's my sense. So, but I don't think he can afford to adopt that kind of position. Yeah. It's good.
Thank you very much. Professor Alessandro Ferrara.
Yes, thanks. I enjoyed very much the paper. Thank you for it. And I'm not familiar with the argument by Mill, but I did learn a lot from your argument about three ways in which ideal theory is essential, even for non-ideal theory. My question is about one claim that I heard in relation as to the relation of Rawls's view of justice as fairness to democratic societies, which I may have misunderstood, but I took it to mean that Rawls's theory of justice as fairness could be relevant for any kind of society, not just for democratic societies. And if I misunderstood you, please ignore the question. If I didn't misunderstand you, I'm wondering here, if that is the case, how can that theory apply to societies that don't go by the assumption of equality of people, the equality of opportunity built into the second principle? And why in the law of peoples would we ever need two runs of the original position in separate stages for the liberal democratic people and for the decent people, if justice as fairness applied beyond liberal democratic society? So I wanted a clarification about that relation of justice as fairness to democratic society. The other thing is the relation of theory of justice to political liberalism. You defended at some point something which I entirely agree with, that political liberalism is not a step into relativism, as many critics of political liberalism claim. You are absolutely right that Rawls has an anti-relativist stance in that later work. But having said that, there are many kinds of anti-relativism in the history of philosophy, and I would like to ask you more about the distinction, the gap that separates the kind of anti-relativism of the theory of justice from that of political liberalism. And it seems to me that in between there is that famous paper of 1980, Kantian Constructivism and Theory of Justice, when Rawls at some point says, what justifies a conception of justice is not its being true to an order antecedent to and given to us, as one could imagine that this rational choice-based deliberation in the original position would necessarily lead to, but rather what justifies justice as fairness is its congruence with our deeper understanding of ourselves and our aspirations, and our realization that given our history and the traditions embedded in our public life, it is the most reasonable doctrine for us, something that is repeated in political liberalism 13 years later at some point. So the reasonable is not there actually in theory of justice at all as a major normative anchoring for justice fairness. So granted that both are anti-relativist, I wanted to prompt you to tell us more about what separates them. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very good. Thank you. Let me try to recall the first. Yeah, so I said that Rawls is relevant. In theory, justice fairness, and I assume that justice fairness would include, in theory, the general conception, right? So, and that's what I meant when I said that justice fairness is relevant to any society. Rawls says that where a society is not capable of maintaining the basic liberties and their priority, then the general conception should apply until it reaches the stage of civilization where it's able to support, those principles. And he says that the special conception is the long run tendency, or should be the long run tendency of the general conception. So in that way, you take societies where people don't accept equality, then we can judge them unjust, not just by the general conception itself, perhaps, if that society is organized so that basically they're disadvantaging the least advantage for the sake of the more advantage, right? That's what general conception said. That applies. And Rawls wants to argue there, that this is what he does argue, look, the long run tendency of applying that conception to non-democratic society should be to reform it, to reach a democratic society, to reach this ideal, the two principles. So that's what I meant. Now, by that claim. Now, you're right, in political liberalism, he had to drop the general conception because he no longer can make claims about the universality of the moral theory because that's a comprehensive doctrine. But that, of course, doesn't, as I argued, that doesn't commit it into any kind of relativism. But you brought up the Kantian constructivism, this kind of halfway position where he was, this is what Sam Scheffler talked about yesterday. I understand what Rawls is doing in Kantian constructivism. In some ways, development of indeed what he was doing in theory, the Kantian interpretation in theory. And he's coming out of Kant, and Kant himself rejects the prior moral order. Kant rejects the idea that the categorical imperative is true of any kind of moral facts or God's commands or anything prior to and independent of our practical reason. It's implicit in practical reasoning. It's a fundamental principle of moral reasoning, just like the hypothetical imperatives are the fundamental principles of reasoning about our own good. That's just what moral reasoning is. That's just what evaluative reasoning is, to follow these principles. And that's what Rawls was doing in Kantian constructivism. He was applying this Kantian view about the principles, moral and principles of practical, moral and evaluative principles of practical reasoning implicit in the way that we think about justice and so on. And he's comparing that with intuitionism, this view that there is this prior moral order, and he's rejecting that. Why? Well, because it's not compatible with autonomy, human autonomy. We have a moral order imposed on us. We're not acting on laws that we give to ourselves out of our own resources. That's what he's trying to do there. But then, of course, you're right, as Sam said yesterday, there's this kind of strange shift also where he is trying to incorporate this into more kind of, well, we're just looking at the ideals and the way that people think, in our society and so on. But again, I think I think Rawls thought up to the end in political liberalism. I don't think he ever gave up his Kantianism. It just got sort of adapted to political liberalism. It's still the same Kantian ideal of persons and the same idea that this is implicit in moral consciousness in a democratic society, right? That's how I understand what he was doing. So there's no mark of relativism, there's no mark of relativism political liberalism. He could still argue to make the Kantian argument that, look, and from my comprehensive view, these are just the fundamental principles of moral reasoning about justice that are implicit in moral consciousness. I think that's what that's what he wanted to believe. Did he believe that with a whole heart? Well, who could? I don't know. That's how but so I don't think it implies relativism in that way. Even in the 1980 Dewey lectures, I don't think there's a whiff of relativism in there about the rejection of a prior moral order. It's coming out of Kant, I think. Yeah, notion of objectivity of judgment preceding moral facts, the moral, that's what you're starting with an idea of the objectivity of moral judgment, and you're constructing, you might say, an idea, well, it makes no sense that you're constructing an idea of moral truth, but you're constructing a realm of moral facts about which our judgments are true, but they're based in objectivity of judgment according to these principles. Yeah. Is that satisfactory, or at least?
It's a big issue. Kantian is Kantian for sure, but it's the question is which kind of Kantianism. I mean, there could be much more to say about the fact that people in the original position somehow, given the fact that they reason from rational choice, they're bound to reach certain conclusions. Let me ask you as a question: do the burdens of judgment apply to the original position as conceived of in the theory of justice, or not? Because if they do, then how can the argument flow? And people unanimously come to the rejection of utilitarianism, intuitionism, and other things. If they don't apply, then because people are following rational choice, then there is a big gap between theory of justice and political liberalism. Granted, both are anti-relativist, but anti-relativist in very different ways.
Yeah, so that's a big question. So the question is, look, I mean, except the burdens of judgment, then the parties in the original position, even though they all have the same information and no particular information about themselves, they're not going to agree on the same conception because they give different emphasis to facts.
Different weight.
And things. Well, the fact is that these are idealized. These are artificial. RAWLS says, it's, he always said, look, it's a mistake. Original position too seriously. These are just I'm talking about principles of practical reason being built into this thought experiment, right? And you bring in certain relevant facts, and so you can have these idealized people, and they all think the same way. I mean, there are no circumstances which really affect their thinking, right? So that's why he wants to say that the parties are not risk averse. Well, of course, people are risk averse, right? But they don't know it. Okay, what do you mean they don't know it? How could they make judgments? They just make. But RAWLS will say, look, I can construct this thought experiment however I want. Risk does not affect their judgment. Similarly, different circumstances, different backgrounds do not affect their judgment. That's what he's saying, really. Yeah, to get his argument, right? Yeah. That's how I understand it. Yeah, that's right. But I agree. There are people who argue that, look, how can you can't make sense of judgment without risk, people's risks, tolerance or intolerance of risk, right? How could you can't make sense of rational choice? This one, I forgot her name, at Berkeley, who moved to Princeton recently. That's her argument against RAWLS. And I guess my reply is RAWLS can construct the original position any way he wants. And just if he says that risk aversion is irrelevant, or people's attitudes to risk are irrelevant, you just abstract from that and you still see how it works. Now, it may be still, this is a lot of people's SIN's response is that, look, even giving RAWLS all he asked for, still it's indeterminate what principles they will agree on, given the list that he gives them. They might agree. Why wouldn't they agree to a prioritarian principle? Say, and that's what he argues, right? And he's very concerned about addressing restricted utilitarianism, where the social minimum is determined by, the principle of restricted utility, and that's when he brings in these different arguments about reciprocity and self-respect, and he admits that argument is not going to bowl a lot of people over, right? So it may not bowl over all the people in the original position, and if not, then the argument for the difference principle is. It's weakened, right? I can agree. Yeah. But that's good. Very good questions. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We would like to continue, but unfortunately, we have to finish now. I would like to thank once more Professor Freeman for his brilliant lecture, which led to an intense discussion that would continue. But I would also like to thank everybody else for attending and for your active participation in the discussion. But still have people want to raise questions, but it's a just sorry, but just to finish, I would like to
Send me an
remind
email.
you,
That's it.
I would like to remind you that we have another interesting day tomorrow with more panels, very interesting panels, starting at the same hour. And we also have another plenary conference with Professor Serena Wolseretti, which is here with us, so to speak. Thank you for your presence here. So thank you very much once more. See you tomorrow. I hope you are enjoying.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Zhao. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.